Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of the people watching us on our live stream and those of you who are tuning in after it's been uploaded to YouTube. Thank you for coming back to our conference, Centering Race in History. We've been on a tremendous journey together, starting in ancient Mesopotamia through to classical antiquity. Yesterday, we delved into medieval Europe and the Middle East, and then into early modernity. Fascinating discussions, arguments, debate. Also, all the big questions were there, and I'd strongly recommend anyone who hasn't yet taken a look at those discussions from day one and day two to dip in, explore. And today, we've just enjoyed a fantastic discussion with our keynote, Dr. Kennetta Hammond Perry, the director of the Stephen Lawrence Research Centre at De Montfort University in UK, and her discussant, Rob Waters at Queen Mary in London. Again, another really pertinent discussion. We delved into the huge issue of state power and state violence in Black history in Britain in the 20th century. Now we are moving on to European imperialism, sticking with the 20th century. And it's my great pleasure to hand over to Professor Lucy Ryle, who's been one of the members of the steering committee for the conference. She's a professor at the European University Institute in Florence in Italy. And it's been a tremendous privilege to have her on board and her department supporting the conference and engaging with it. And I shall hand over to you now, Lucy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. It's been a pleasure working with you. It's been fascinating to put together all these papers and to be here today. So I'm going to basically introduce the first speaker. And they each have 15 minutes left, 15 minutes each, which should allow some time for discussion afterwards. I'd ask them to try to keep to that time as much as possible. So Jan Rybak is our first speaker. He's a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of York in the Department of Politics. He studied history at the University of Salzburg and did his PhD with us in History and Civilization at the European University Institute. He's also held positions in the University of Salzburg, at Polin and the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, and New York University and the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. His dissertation is revised and will be published by OUP in 2021, and its title is Everyday Zionism in East Central Europe, 1914 to 1920, Nation Building in War and Revolution. I had the privilege of being one of his examiners, and I can heartily recommend the book that it will be. And the title, they're actually talking about something different today, so I'm looking forward to hearing it. The title of his paper is How Concepts of Race Shaped Responses to Disease. The case of the 1915-1918 typhus epidemic. Jan, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that, Lucy. It's a great pleasure to see you. And thank you very much for this introduction. I am going to share my screen here just very briefly. So I'm going to talk about a specific disease, a specific epidemic that occurred during the First World War in German-occupied Poland, and will draw connections to what we're experiencing today. To start, the pandemic that changed our lives so much since the beginning of this year has not only brought suffering and death on a large scale, but also a notable rise of racist stigmatization of ethnic groups as supposed carriers and spreaders of the disease. But to this come also border closures, often implemented by politicians who had for years demanded harsher immigration regimes. In all this, and most notably in the higher mortality rates of minorities, race is at the center of this story. While terrifying, not all of these dynamics are novel. As historians love to say, this is nothing new. I know that, I'm working on that. So the use of public health emergency to advance a political agenda, the stigmatization of minorities as spreaders of disease, indeed the othering and the racialization of disease itself has much historical precedent. And I'll be speaking about one particular case in that, the typhus epidemic in German-occupied Poland during the First World War. I'll thereby attempt to show how contemporaries' racialized conceptions of disease played out and show how were these concepts that then shaped the public health and public policy response. When the German armies conquered large parts of the Russian Empire in 1915, its soldiers, its doctors, its bureaucrats were confronted with seemingly new, deadly disease that seemed to spread like wildfire. Typhus exanthematicus, in German is called Fleckfieber, in Yiddish Fleckentyphus, is a highly infectious bacterial disease commonly transmitted by lice. On an ideological level, for the Germans, the presence of this disease in the East that they occupied, seemed to confirm their imagination of the East as such, as a filthy, backward, and terrifying region that required harsh measures, discipline, and cleansing. In practice, authorities panicked about the prospect of themselves and their soldiers getting infected. In order to prevent this, they introduced a system of surveillance and suppression, which included the creation of delousing facilities, quarantine wards, and I'll come back to them, and a crackdown on anyone suspected to be infected. And this was a response that was highly racialized and targeted one specific group of the population, the Jewish population, especially in the major urban centers. But it was the war itself and the occupation that eventually created the conditions for the outbreak and the spread of the disease. The large-scale displacement of people who flocked to the major cities and were crammed into tiny apartments and underground dwellings. This, in addition to the exhaustions of hunger, inadequate sanitary installations, caused tens of thousands to get infected and several thousands to die over the course of those 4 years actually. The German authorities cracked down brutally on those who they identified or suspected to be carriers of the disease, and from the beginning, this focused almost exclusively on the Jewish population. Houses were repeatedly raided and inhabitants checked for signs of illnesses. Especially in Warsaw and Łódź, apartments were then disinfected and residents sent to delousing stations, followed by several weeks of quarantine in hastily erected prison-like hospitals. Several accounts describe the horrors, mistreatment, and the humiliation that came with these measures. In her autobiography, Hane, a girl born in 1912, remembered the crackdown by the authorities after a neighbor contracted the illness. And I quote, "Under the German occupation, whenever someone became sick with a communicable disease, the entire household was sent to a quarantine where we were treated worse than prisoners. The building where we were held was like a prison. A tall brick wall surrounded it, and there was a barbed wire fence, bars on the windows, and an armed guard at the door. They barely gave us enough food to hold body and soul together," end quote. In his autobiography, the great writer Isaac Bashevis Singer described the process of disinfection after his brother Moishe had fallen ill in 1916. Quote, they are the health authorities and the German authorities. "They did come and spray the house, and the air was filled with poison. Mother and I went off with a policeman, mother carrying the few things she had been permitted to pack, in a strange house full of male and female guards. Another boy and I had our hair cut. I saw my red sidelocks fall, and I knew this was the end of them," end quote. The situation was also terrible in Vilno, today's Vilnius, as Hirsch Abramowitz, a local, remembered. When someone came down with the disease, quote, "The person would be confined to the hospital. The director of the hospital," in quotation marks, was usually the local Feldscher, a military physician assistant, who often did not appear there for days at a time. No treatment was offered, and outsiders were strictly forbidden to enter the place. The patient was thus sentenced to die. Indeed, the people considered the hospital a morgue, end quote. Naturally, given these conditions, given these circumstances, and given these brutal measures by the regime, many people were terribly afraid of the prospect of being sent to these disinfection and stations and to the hospitals, and tried to avoid being detected by the authorities. As one observer noted, the mere mention of the disinfecting station sent terror into the hearts of the Jews, end quote. Jewish community leaders did their best to respond to the outbreak of the disease. However, seemingly losing control of the situation, the German authorities' focus increasingly shifted away from a medical problem of treating an infectious disease towards identifying and tackling a perceived racial problem that was the infected people themselves. It is, and I quote here, "It is a truly Jewish fever," wrote Gottfried Frey, the German chief medical officer in occupied Poland. Indeed, the authorities came to see typhus as a Jewish racial phenomenon, affecting not only the urban proletariat and refugees, but everyone, merely because of one's Jewishness. The Pole, Frey, the German chief medical officer, reported, was, quote, "by nature cleaner than the Jew," end quote. If non-Jews did contract the disease, it was because they had been in close contact with Jews, or because, quote, "they had adopted the filthy habits of the Jews," end quote. So in this mindset of these German authorities and the people who shaped the medical response, getting the illness was understood as a form of becoming Jewish or violating the boundaries of race. And this is what determined the response. The German authorities assessed, the medical professionals assessed, that about 95% of those infected were Jews. Other sources point to lower numbers, but they're actually, neither of them are relevant because the statistical data from occupied Poland collected in this context is completely unreliable. The mortality rate amongst non-Jewish Poles was notably higher than amongst Jews. In Warsaw, 13.4% compared to 6.4%. Erich Martini, a German Navy doctor and expert on infectious diseases, who was based in Włocławek, reported that during his time there, he counted 452 Christians who contracted typhus, of whom 80 died, and 712 Jews, of whom 90 died. Already this strongly contradicting this claim that this is a purely Jewish phenomenon. Key to explaining this disproportionality seemed to have been that the authorities' conviction that this was a racial phenomenon, that Jews were the carriers of the disease, made them focus all their efforts on controlling the urban Jewish populations, disinfecting houses and people. And thereby, naturally, they identified more cases amongst the Jews. At the same time, they had very little knowledge, basically no knowledge, of what was going on in the countryside, where fewer Jews lived and where there was hardly an existing medical infrastructure. So when cases of typhus appeared in the countryside, nobody reported them to the central authorities. Effectively, the authorities' a priori existing assumption about the disease as being Jewish led them to gather highly distorted data that would confirm their assumptions and confirm their worldview and their notion that this was a racial phenomenon. The racialization of typhus and the identification of Jews as primary carriers, supposed primary carriers of the disease, was not a natural occurrence, but resulted from decisions that medical professionals and bureaucrats took, and other medical professionals took different decisions. A doctor, for example, who served with the German troops in a field hospital in Istanbul, identified Greeks as the main carriers of the disease, which he believed was caused by, quote, widespread alcoholism amongst members of this race, end quote, whereas he was convinced that Jews, Germans, and Turks were rather resistant to typhus. Depending on whether doctors decided that racial categories were relevant to an understanding of the disease or not, they reached different conclusions. Paul Kroner-Charlottenburg for example, who had the Institute of Hygiene in the multi-ethnic city of Łódź, equally examined German, Jewish, and Polish patients, and he excluded the factor race from his empirical research and drew conclusions in regard to sex and age, which he regarded to be key determinants whether somebody would fall ill and eventually die of the disease. However, the narrative was shaped primarily by doctors who firmly believed that the racial category was essential for the understanding and containment of the disease, first and foremost by Chief Medical Officer Gottfried Frey, who would later make a career in the Nazi Party and the Nazi state. Frey not only shaped the response to the disease in occupied Poland, but also the way in which his superiors in Berlin were informed about the situation. He coined the term of typhus as, quote, a truly Jewish disease, and argued that, quote, only when an entirely new people educated to cleanliness will have replaced the Polish Jews, true progress will be possible, end quote. And already here, I think we can see very strongly a foreshadowing without, while we don't want to be deterministic, but there already this discourse about racial concepts in the East already foreshadow here in the First World War the later horrors of the Second World War. For German physicians and bureaucrats, typhus presented itself as a racialized threat from the East, profoundly endangering the German Volkskörper, the body of the nation, that was already strained by the hardships of war. For many, including many German physicians and officials, the elevation of the German race in the context of the war and its protection against the foreign threat of both disease and foreign races was of paramount importance to the war effort and to the future of the nation. From the beginning, the German administration was concerned with the possibility of the import of the disease from occupied Poland. This corresponded well with the demands by anti-Semites, who had for years called for the closing of Germany's eastern border to Jewish immigration. With the outbreak of the war, the anti-Semitic paranoia of a wave of East European Jewish immigration was revived, and disease played a key role in this discourse. In 1915 article, for instance, the pan-German Wolfgang Heinze argued for a complete ban on immigration based on racial criteria. However, he believed that such measures were impossible to implement in the existing legal framework, and he therefore suggested a legalistic workaround in order to exclude Jews on the basis of supposedly objective legal and scientific criteria. It would be, quote, a particularly convenient but also justified measure for the repulsion of these undesirable elements, he wrote, if Jews would be medically examined at the border and then repulsed as a threat to public health. It was in this context that the German government in April 1918 shut its border to Poland to Jews, only to Jews, for the fact that they were Jews and therefore identified as spreaders of a disease that they understood in racial terms. In its decree, the German Ministry of the Interior stated that the thousands of Polish Jewish workers who had come to Germany to work in the war industry in previous years were a health hazard. Quote, a special hazard derives from the entire population's incredible uncleanliness in regard to matters of health. For great part lies written the Polish Jewish workers are particularly likely transmitters of typhus and other infectious diseases. End quote. And this was despite the fact that there were no documented cases of disease spreading amongst Polish Jewish workers in Germany. There were outbreaks amongst Christian Polish agricultural workers and especially Russian prisoners of war, both living under miserable conditions in Germany. But the logic of race as a determining factor of disease and the anti-Semitic imaginations of physicians and bureaucrats that shaped their research and eventually public policy had a dynamic of its own. The ban on immigration of Jews from Poland remained in place in one form or the other until the 1920s. The idea of Jews, especially from Eastern Europe, being carriers of disease, while it had existed before, came to be an absolutely central feature in anti-Semitic conceptualization of the world, and especially in Nazi propaganda, with all its horrors would be inflicted in the Second World War. Saying this, to conclude, because I'm out of time, we're not only being reminded of racist comments on the current situation, and I don't need to quote anyone in particular here, But we're also being reminded on of the physical attacks on especially Asian minorities at the beginning of this pandemic, especially. But also, we should think about how today several quite respectable scientists and journalists representations, many of whom attempted to interpret higher mortality rates amongst minorities, for example, with supposedly racial genetic factors. All of these assumptions remain completely unproven and remain illusions and delusions, sorry. But it speaks to the depressing longevity of the pseudoscientific racial conceptualizations of disease that are so prominent, have been so prominent in the past and continue to play a role. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for that. Sorry, let me put my video on. So you, the host has disabled my video, that's fine. Thank you, Jan, for that wonderful paper. Really fascinating. I have to say, of course, incredibly timely. Let me just, yeah, here I am. So our next speaker is Yair Wallach, who is a senior lecturer in Israeli studies at SOAS in the University of London. And he's also the head of the SOAS Center for Jewish Studies. He's a cultural and social historian of modern Palestine, Israel. And he's published articles on urban visual and visual culture and on Jewish-Arab relations. His book, A City in Fragments, Urban Text in Modern Jerusalem, was published by Stanford University Press in 2020. And it looks at Arabic and Hebrew street texts in modern Jerusalem. He's currently, unlucky you, a Leverhulme Research Fellow, and his project, The Arab Ashkenazi, looks at Jewish Ashkenazi acculturation in the Arab Levant. He also has published articles in Haaretz, The Guardian, and other media. The title of his paper this afternoon is Centering Race in Medical History, the Fanonian Stance. Yair, the floor is yours.
Yes, but that's not my title, but you'll see it in a second. Okay, so let me find my presentation. Okay, so I am going to talk about race and partition in Palestine. So to say first, I mean, this is a work in progress. It's a departure from my previous work, which focused on material culture and urban history. It started with an article I wrote for the journal in Arabic, Qadaya Israeliya, Israeli Affairs, on the question of partition, the origins of partition. And it was a short article published 2 years ago, and in which I started thinking about the question of race there. And this is what I want to develop here. But also the last few years I've been given plenty of opportunities to think about anti-Semitism, to rethink questions of anti-Semitism and its role and its connection to Israel-Palestine. Okay, so that's a kind of the background. Now the question of my paper is, how do we get to partition? And specifically, how do we get to partition if we understand Zionism as a settler colonial movement? If we think of the situation in Palestine as a settler colonial situation, how do we get to partition? Because when we look at other cases of settler colonialism, they do not end typically with partition. I mean, the kind of scenarios that we are familiar with are genocide, incorporation of the remains of the indigenous population in settler society. In some cases, like South Africa, we can talk about incorporation of settlers into indigenous society, or in some cases like Algeria, we can talk about settler exodus. But where is partition in this story? And I think the fact that partition is not one of these familiar outcomes is not accidental. It's because for partition, to accept partition as a principle, you need to accept equivalence between the settlers and indigenous population, that both of these populations have equal claim for the land. Both of these populations have equal right for self-determination. Now that, of course, goes against the logic of settler colonialism, which assumes that the settlers have superior moral rights over territory, over resources, and so forth. So it's not surprised that this is not a familiar outcome of settler colonialism. Now, if we look, where do we see settler colonialism in the 20th century? So this is a kind of a list, starting with Ireland, going through the partition of the empires of after the First World War, and then most of the partitions we are familiar with are around the middle of the 20th century after World War II, talking about India, Palestine, Germany between East and West, then China, which we can see as some kind of a partition, and then Korea, Vietnam, and the latest case in that kind of 20th century history is Cyprus. So I think you can see that the only case here which we can say is settler colonialism is the case of Palestine. So it really stands out. And of course, the other exception is Ireland. I should say that we can think of Ireland as a colonial situation, but I think there's sufficient case to make that it is also quite different from other cases. And when people discuss Israel as a settler colonial state, they usually don't talk about compared to Ireland. Comparisons to North America, South Africa, Australia, and so forth. And we can say more, but I want to be brief here. I think it's interesting to think of French Algeria and South Africa, because to qualify what I said earlier, in both of these cases, we do see the idea of partition emerges. It's put on the table. In the case of French Algeria, there is an idea of partitioning it to a European Pied Noir state and the rest of Algeria. And there's a fascinating article by Arthur Asraf on this about the kind of the Israel option for Algeria. And he describes it as something that is on the edge of possibility. It's considered, but never seen as a serious option, and for various reasons, which I won't go into. In the case of South Africa, you can say that the Bantustans are an attempt, attempt to pass a partition. But again, there's various differences. But I think the most striking difference is that in South Africa, these Bantustans were rejected both by the local population, but also by international public opinion, which never accepted it as a legitimate, as a reasonable form of political partition. Unlike in Israel-Palestine, where for the last 70 or 80 years, partition is the consensus solution, so to speak. The idea that this is where things should go. From 1937, where it's first seriously put on the table, until this morning, the international community sees partition as the solution. So I think Israel-Palestine does stand out in this regard. So when I think of the question of race and Zionism, there's various writings on this. What I want to focus here is not the way race plays out within Zionist thought, but the way the Zionist movement is understood by the British government mainly, but also more internationally by Western powers, and how do they racialize the Zionist project? Okay, and here there's far less literature. Most of it related somewhat to the Balfour Declaration. There's and I'll engage specifically with James Renton's argument later here. But here to start with, I want to go, before we start talking about partition, to understand the racialization of Jews and Zionism. So let's compare two texts. And one of them is the Uganda offer, the offer from the British government to the Zionist movement in 1903 to establish a Zionist a colony in East Africa, which was considered and ultimately rejected by the Zionist movement, and compare this to the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which people are much more familiar, and people are much more familiar with the text of the Balfour Declaration. So I'm kind of giving you bits of these texts, and I think it's striking that the text of the Uganda offer is almost never discussed. So when you look at the Uganda offer, and I've highlighted certain elements here, it is clearly that this is about a Jewish colony in East Africa, a settler colony. There's no doubt about this from the language that is used here. It's suggested as a scheme for the amelioration of the position of the Jewish race. So the idea that it's a more as a humanitarian, to help the Jews, so to speak. It talks about the need to identify vacant lands where this could be established. It talks specifically about a Jewish colony or settlements and giving it a considerable area of land. It talks about local autonomy and Jewish self-rule, Jewish official as chief of a local administration. And there's the only references to the kind of specifically Jewish character is the message of a religious right and so forth. Now, compare this to the Balfour Declaration in 1917, and it is striking how much the Balfour Declaration does not look like a settler colonial text. It does not look like a text that is talking about the settler colonial project. I think if you didn't know anything about the Balfour Declaration, and you might think the Jews are already living there as a majority, it talks about a national home for the Jewish people. It mentioned the civil, and national home is a very ambiguous term, as we know. It talks about existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. And of course, this is a very offensive term that kind of erases the identity of 90% of the Palestinian population at this point, but it compares it to the Uganda offer where the local population is non-existent. I think it's striking. And it mentions the need to safeguard also the rights of Jews elsewhere. So it positions the support for Zionism in a kind of configuration that has impact on Jews, on the Jewish diaspora, which the first text does not do at all. Now, I think if we, so this is a text that doesn't look like a settler colonial project, even though what it does effectively is to start the facilitation of immigration, settlements, and land purchasing. And if we will look, for example, at the terms of the mandate, Palestine Mandate 1922, we'll find it somewhere halfway between these two texts, but because their settlement and land are mentioned. So what I'd like to say is that for the British in Palestine, there's competing frames of reference where they can talk about Zionism and about Jews. One of them is to view them as a religious community. Another is to think about them as a national community. And another is to think about them as settlers. And they use all these things at the same time and put emphasis on different times and different moments. So let's jump to the 37 Palestine Royal Commission, which is the first time where a partition is put straight on the table. And there's various literature on partition, especially from recent years, which I'm not going to go, don't have the time to go into in great detail. But the idea is, here I would like to reference James Renson's article, The End of the Semites, which mentions this as the end of the idea of Jews and Arabs are both Semitic race and can live together, because you need to divide them, and you see a qualitative difference between Jews, which are primarily European culture, and the Oriental Arabs. And I want to qualify and somewhat argue with this argument to a degree. What we see in the 37 partition plan is that it sees the conflict as between two national communities within one land. This is how it sees the problem, and that is why it arrives at partition. And I'm not going to, this is from the very long report of the Peel Commission. And he talks about both sides want national independence. The Jews don't want to be a minority under Arab rule. The Arabs don't want to be a minority under Jewish rule. So it puts it a kind of a nationality problem, a minority problem, which are, you know, a lot of things are discussed in this way. But when it needs to make comparisons, it compares the Jews, for example, to the Greeks of Smyrna or to the Assyrians in Iraq. It does not compare them to settlers, to white settlers in South Africa. It does not compare them to other kinds of, you know, settler colonial projects. And it talks about the Jews as self-reliant progressive people, European for the most part in outlook and equipment, if not in race. And I think if not in race is crucial here. For the Royal Commission to understand the Jews as equivalent to Arabs, because they're both national communities, although the Jews are most of the recent migrants from Europe involved in a settler project, is to think of them as not European in race, as a community that's originally from Palestine and therefore has a sort of equivalence to the kind of Oriental Arab. And this is the partition plan which suggests a partition between a Jewish state and an Arab state and a British enclave, and crucially also population exchange, or in effect expulsion of Palestinian Arabs from the Galilee, which is rejected, you know, overwhelmingly by the Arab minority. And this also, when we look at the UN plan from 47, we see the same thing. Here also, there's hardly any references to Jewish colonization or the Jews or the Zionists as a settler colonial movement, but it is understood as two national movements. And the report says, here are the sole remaining representatives of the Semitic race. You know, they can live together. They need partition because these are two national communities, but they are equivalent. Okay, and I'll end with my conclusion is that partition was not a settler colonial solution. Its logic denied and downplayed the settler colonial dimension of Zionism. In the historical context of the 30s and 40s, this denial stemmed from a racialized categorization of European Jews as European in culture, but not in race, and assumed racial equivalence between Jews and Arabs, rather than a conflict between European settlers and Arab Palestinian natives. British and international policymakers saw in Palestine a conflict between two non-European nations, one indigenous to the land and the other one re-established here. And I've run out of time, so I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. Excuse me a second. Thank you very much for your very interesting paper. Apologies again for getting the title wrong. It's slightly confusing the layout of the conference in my defense. But now we do have the announced paper by Fela Benabed, and just excuse me one moment while I pull up the details. Fela Benabed, who's an associate professor at Annaba University, Algeria. She holds a doctor's degree in literature, a PhD in literature, with a thesis entitled Native American Eco-Narratives of Healing, a Study of Selected Novels. She's also a US Department of State alumna, taking part in the study of the United States Institute on Contemporary American Literature, University of Louisville, Kentucky, in 2011. She's interested in the post-colonial narrative, medical and ecological approaches to literature, and is presently leading a research project entitled Literature and Medicine, Nurturing Clinical Empathy and Holistic Care, and has been selected for a Fulbright Scholar Fellowship on this topic of literature and medicine, and it's scheduled for the spring of 2021 at Columbia University. As you can tell we're going to watch a video of her paper because she can't be joining us together today, but the title of The paper is now Centering Race in Medical History, the Fanonian Stance. Thank you all for your patience.
Dear colleagues, I hope you're fine and healthy, and I'm sorry for not being able to present my paper live on Zoom. Yet, I will hopefully be here with you at the end of the video to answer your questions. I will start with an introduction, then give a brief reference to Fanon's Itinerary. I will focus on his critique of scientific racism, and after that, I will talk about Fanon and Sartre's discussion of racism-induced nervous conditions. Later, I will draw attention to Fanon's pioneering work on transcultural therapy before moving to his new humanism as an idealistic remedy to racism. I will, of course, end with a conclusion and references. Frantz Fanon, the social-political psychiatrist and anti-colonialist intellectual whose name still resonates in the fight against dehumanizing racism, grew up in Martinique, studied in France, and practiced psychiatry in North Africa. His experience instilled in him the stance that colonization, with its underlying racism, is a great purveyor of psychiatric hospitals. Let's see a brief reference to Fanon's Itinerary. Landing in metropolitan France, driven by patriotic and humanist ideals at the age of 18, Fanon experienced racism while he had voluntarily engaged in the struggle against German occupation. He told his friend Marcel Manville, quote, "Chaque fois que la dignité et la liberté de l'homme sont en question, nous sommes concernés, blancs, noirs ou jaunes. Et chaque fois qu'elles seront menacées en quelque lieu que ce soit, je m'engagerai sans retour." I translate, "Whenever man's dignity and freedom is in question, we are all concerned, white, black, or yellow. And whenever they will be threatened anywhere, I would be committed without turning back." In the newly liberated France, however, Fanon soon discovered that he was objectified as a Negro by the white gaze. For metropolitan French people of that time who were victims of color prejudice, the Negro, between quotation marks, represented an almost animal being, associated with paradoxical cliches of sexual predation, savagery, merriness, and meekness. Fanon's early encounter with racism, which has initiated his reflection on racial injustice, continued during his military service under the French banner in colonial Algeria, where he witnessed the ordeals of its native population. In 1953, Fanon was appointed head of Blida Joinville Hospital's Department of Psychiatry in Algeria, where he discovered the bleak face of the French civilizing mission. He developed a clinical commitment to treat the victims of the racist system he personally had suffered from, albeit to a lesser degree in his native Martinique. He was stunned by the poverty of the indigenous population whose humanity was denied while the colonial system plundered the country's resources. When the Algerian War of Independence broke up, Fanon became one of its fervent defenders. He joined the Front of National Liberation and treated wounded soldiers. He decided to quit his job at the hospital because he found it impossible to practice medicine in a place of, quote, systematized dehumanization, end of quote. In the letter to the resident minister, he revealed his sense of guilt for serving in an institution of, quote, systematized dehumanization, end of quote. He languished that psychiatry, a discipline that should reconcile patients with their environment, strived to alienate the colonized in their own country, causing them to live in, quote, absolute depersonalization, end of quote. His active involvement in the War of Independence caused his deportation from Algeria in 1957. Fanon's critique of scientific racism. Colonial medicine considered the etiology of African primitivism, between quotation marks, as innate. In other words, it advances that human behavior is controlled by genes or some other biological component. In this genetic or biological determinist view, the mental disturbance of native populations are simply their fate. Colonial medicine attributed the failure of the health system in any colony to an issue in the native community, like an innate biological structure or rigid attachment to cultural tradition. Reflecting on the particular context of Algeria, Fanon argued that, quote, Western medical science was one of the most tragic characteristics of the oppressive system because it was introduced at the same time as racialism and humiliation. End of quote. Colonial medicine relied on scientific racism to essentialize the colonized behavior as determined by an innate inferiority in their brain structure. While a fully developed frontal cortex governed the Europeans' behavior, the Algiers School of Psychiatry assumed the diencephalon, that is, quote, one of the most primitive parts of the brain, end of quote, governed the Algerians' behavior. Their cerebral structure was allegedly responsible for their laziness, quote, mental and social aptitude, as well as their virtual animal impulsiveness, end of quote. Antoine Porot, the father of the Algiers School of Psychiatry, drew a grim portrait of the Algerians as violent beings by heredity, born with congenital compulsivity and aggressiveness that usually took the form of homicide, as opposed to Europeans who usually committed suicide under melancholic conditions. The English School of Colonial Psychiatry was embodied by John Colin Carruthers, who presented a report to the World Health Organization entitled The African Mind in Health and Disease, a Study in Ethnopsychiatry in 1953. In this report, adult Africans were depicted as children with an elevated level of emotional lability and inability to grow up, which was comparable to lobotomized Europeans. Furthermore, colonial psychiatry indicated that Africans, quote, tended to be psychotic rather than neurotic, with a tendency towards schizophrenia rather than depressive disorders, while manic depression required a strong sense of personal responsibility, a quality originating in European culture, end of quote. Such claims on racial differences in psychiatric disorders were appended by scientific racism and craniology, which, since the 17th century to the middle of the 20th century, claimed empirical results to justify racial differences. Racism-induced nervous conditions. In his foreword to The Wretched of the Earth, Jean-Paul Sartre considered that, quote, the status of native is a nervous condition introduced and maintained by the settler among colonized people with their consent, end of quote. Fanon objected to the advocacy of genetic determinism in mental illness, and without neglecting its partial biological etiology, observed the equal importance of the sociogeny, which means the social genesis of mental illness. In the colony, according to him, madness was predominantly a pathology of freedom, between quotation marks, and alienation from the environment. Transcultural therapy. While still a psychiatry resident, Fanon noted that, quote, the prognosis is in the hands of those who are willing to get rid of the worm-eaten roots of the structure, end of quote. The word structure refers to the racist colonial status quo whose subversion would ease the nervous conditions caused by colonial oppression. Starting from the premise that, quote, the biological, the psychological, the sociological were only separated by an aberration of the mind, end of quote, Fanon and Azoulay decided to practice social therapy or sociotherapy at Blida-Joinville Hospital in Algeria. Fanon had learned this therapeutic method from François Tosquel at Saint-Alban Hospital in France. It consists in establishing a miniature society inside the psychiatric ward, and it involves the treatment of the institution before the treatment of the patient. The other name for this was institutional psychotherapy. Social therapy attempts to reduce stress factors in the hospital and provides the opportunity of sociability to the inmates by encouraging them to take some responsibilities. This innovative method initially failed in the Muslim men's pavilion because the latter would find no interest in the activities, and the meetings would take place in absolute silence or in general brouhaha and brawl. Fanon, with his intern Azulai, observed that work therapy, which is part of social therapy, did not interest inmates because the notions of work in the French metropolis and the Algerian colony were different. Asking Algerian farmers to weave baskets, for instance, could not yield results because they perceived it as a feminine task. Theater, games, and choral evenings were also rejected because they were not part of the local culture. Fanon and Azulai understood that they had fallen into the trap of Western psychiatry by presupposing the universality of therapeutic practices. They had overlooked the principle of cultural relativism that consists in understanding the traditions and values of the local society. Accordingly, they started thinking about ways to graft St. Alban's social therapy on the local context. It was a pioneering reflection in transcultural psychiatry. They selected a battery of activities that could capture the inmates' interest, like gardening, maintenance, football, and the Moorish cafe with local music. They equally considered the importance of religion for their patients and asked the mufti, which means Muslim priest, to visit the psychiatric department on a regular basis, followed by storytellers and finally an orchestra to rehabilitate the patients through music. Hence, even though social therapy was not a panacea for mental issues, it, quote, reactivates delusional and hallucinatory processes. It provokes new dramatizations and enables the doctor to understand better what may have happened outside. End of quote. This groundbreaking experiment momentarily transformed the psychiatric ward at Blida Hospital into a small social milieu with empowering human relations and responsibilities. New humanism. Humanism, which does not discriminate between human beings because of their race, can be observed at both ends of Fanon's short but seminal writing career. In the first page of his first piece of writing, Black Skin, White Masks, he declared his intention to write, quote, for a new humanism, end of quote. In the last page of his final piece of writing, The Wretched of the Earth, he concluded, quote, for Europe, for ourselves, and for humanity, comrades, we must make a new start, develop a new way of thinking, and endeavor to create a new man, end of quote. To conclude, Fanon's reflections are still valid today, mainly because of his concept of epidermalization or internalization of inferiority that still plagues former colonized peoples, roughly 70 after their flag independence. His thought also remains topical in the current anti-racist and anti-imperialist struggles around the world. For example, his numerous uses of the word breathe is a useful tool to study George Floyd's death cry, I can't breathe, and the Black Lives Matter movement. In Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon wrote, quote, I have to throw off an attacker who is strangling me because I literally cannot breathe, end of quote. And in A Dying Colonialism, he concluded that, quote, under these conditions, the individual's breathing is an observed and occupied breathing. It is a combat breathing. He often used similar words like suffocated and smothered to depict the experience of the oppressed and the need for combat breathing to put an end to racist dehumanization.
Okay, I think we've finished. I'm not right. Yeah. Excuse me. It still takes a bit of time. Right, well, I hope you all agree that was a fascinating paper. And now, our last speaker this evening is Daphne Budash, who is a PhD researcher in history at the EUI in Florence. Her research deals with gender dynamics and interracial sexual encounters in British East Africa at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. In particular, it addresses the impact of the Indian presence on racial and gender relations in colonial Kenya. She completed a BA in history at Lausanne University in Switzerland, an MA in history at Queen Mary in London, and a professional master's degree in public history at the Université Paris-Est Créteil. Before coming to the EUI, she worked as a curator, assistant curator for the House of European History in Brussels. In addition to her research for her PhD, she's involved in several public history projects and is most particularly the co-founder of the Post-Colonial Italy Mapping Colonial Heritage Project, which I know and I recommend to you all. Her paper today is entitled Brown Men, Black Women, White Anxiety, Indian Migration, Interracial Sexuality, and Colonial Categorization in British East Africa. Daphne, over to you.
Thank you, Lucy. I'll try to share my screen now. So let's see how this works. So I assume you can see it, right? Yeah. Okay. So thanks, Lucy, for the introduction, and thank the organizer of the conference for giving me the opportunity to present my current PhD research. So this is still a work in progress, obviously, but I'm really happy. A bit of context. Let me see. Okay. So in 1895, British East Africa Protectorate was proclaimed, and the same years, colonial authorities started importing indentured labor from India, who were specifically Muslim and Sikh men from Punjab. And they imported this labor to build the railway connecting the coast to Lake Victoria. At the same period, another class of Indians, who included merchants, moneylanders, and traders, came to settle in the region as well. So there were Muslims, Hindu, and also Christians from Goa. In addition to Indian migration, white settlers and businessmen arrived in the region with the intention of developing farming and industrial businesses. So European and Indian migration was initially encouraged by the colonial administration as an economic driver. However, the white settlers, driven by the ambition of building a white man's country, soon started to oppose Indian settlement. So at the turn of the 20th century, Indian migration was an empire-wide phenomenon, and the Colonial Office tried to regulate it. So in 1908, there was formed a committee called the Sanderson Committee that was given the role to investigate the question of immigration from India to the Crown colonies. So this committee conducted a large amount of interviews with various actors from each colony, including governors, railway managers, European settlers, travelers, etc. No need to say that neither Indian migrant nor local indigenous people were invited to testify. So the papers of this committee constitute an interesting source as they reveal different views regarding Indian mobility within the empire, while at the same time addressing question of racial categories, Indian masculinity, and interracial sexuality. So let's start. The disastrous absence of women. So an interesting element that appears in the investigation of the situation in British East Africa is the issue of gender imbalance among the Indian community. So here's an abstract from the minutes of the minutes of the committee, and you see that, so you have one administrator who is asked, no woman came with those being the Indian workers, on the railway? He replied, no. What was the result? Did you hear? Yes, rather disastrous. So in the early days of the protectorate, Indian migration counted indeed almost no women. And this is explained by the fact that the building of the railway was considered a man's job. So no women workers were required. And with regard to Indian traders and merchants, if they were married, they tended to bring their wives only after having settled successfully their business. So the lack of Indian women raised some anxieties among colonial administrators. And here, what's the name of Arthur Matheson doesn't explain what he meant by disastrous, but he suggested later that an Indian indentured were lacking moral values and were a bad class of people, and presumably lacking sexual morality as well. But Indian masculinity was not always perceived as a source of troubles. And here we have another example that is also a minute from the committee, from the interviews. So here the commissioner of lands and East Africa Protectorate is asked the same question about the absence of women. There were, and I quote, there were no women who came with them at all. He replied, very few, I should think, but that led to no trouble as far as one knows. Of course, they have lived with the women of the country very often. The women of the country are not particular in that way about caste or other prejudices, and he replied, no. So this testimony suggests that Indian workers were often engaged in intimate relations with indigenous women. And the mention of interracial wedlock captured the committee attention later and led to further inquiry. And what the other minutes of the other interview revealed, and I don't have time now to show you all the material I have, but it shows that most administrators were on the ground, were actually aware of the practice, but they did not necessarily share the same view. I will share this with you. So this is here is an example of a strong opposition to the practice that was expressed by Sir John Kirk, former chairman of the committee in charge of the Uganda Railway. And for him, he thinks that the half-caste race between Indian and African is one of the worst mixtures that there can be. So he's describing especially the case on the coast between the mix of Indian and Swahili, and they said that those were useless physically, morally, they were bad, and they were no advantage at all. And he added at the end, so if Indians were brought over in any settlement, they ought to come with their wives and families. So here, Kirk's opposition to interracial union is rooted in the fear of race mixing. His concern with racial degeneration was shared by many administrators at that time, and it echoed, of course, the rise of eugenics thinking in the early 20th century. But what's important to understand is like intimacy between Indians and East African women not only triggered ideological debate on race and eugenics, the existence of mixed-race children directly challenged the racial categories that underlies British imperial policies. And here comes the problem of racial definition. And this is still part of the Sanderson Committee minutes. And the chairman asked the general manager of the East African Railway here, so there comes this difficulty. How can you define an Indian? We will take it an Indian has remained in East Africa and has married an African wife. Would you consider the offspring Indian? They are born in the country and one of the parents is African? And he replied, that's a legal point of view, I'm afraid I could not answer. And the chairman continued commenting, saying, I'm only talking about the practical difficulty of setting what an Indian is. It seems to me it would be very difficult, like the question about the people you admit in certain branches of the public service and the difficulty of laying down what is exactly an Englishman or a subject of the United Kingdom is very great. So the difficulty encountered when trying to define what is an Indian or what is an Englishman reflect not only the social construction of these categories, but also the colonial need to rely on such classification. In that sense, mixed-race children contested the supposed natural distinction between coexisting populations. From a practical point of view, mixed-race children also compromised the adoption of a clear policy to control the Indian as a distinct social group. And now I would like to move a bit away from the British and colonial perspective and this idea of white anxiety to ask the question of what do we actually know about these mixed race relations. What do we know about this mixed race relation? Colonial archives tell us more about British colonial attitude towards sexuality and race, but not really about the life of colonized people. And this is not a well-documented topic in my case. It's really difficult to evaluate the scale of the phenomenon and the number of children born from these relationships, especially since the colonial administration did not register them into a distinct racial category. So I've been looking for alternative sources to investigate the reality of these interracial couples and to understand which social factors allowed exogamy. So I found several stories, and here is an extract of a testimony of an Indian African descent that has been collected by anthropologist Cynthia Salvadori in the 90s. So the interviewee told the story of his family. His father, uncle worked as an indentured for the railway in the early days of the Protectorate and then stayed in British East Africa. And his nephew, so the narrator's father, joined him when he was really young. So here is the quote. Our father, uncle had married a Gypsy woman, and our father did likewise. He married a girl whom he met on a bus on which he was a conductor. That's our mother. She became a Muslim and took a Muslim name. She was made a Muslim by a local Muslim priest, a Nubian. When our parents' first child, our elder sister, was born, the birth certificate has the name of the Nubian priest in the place of name of the mother's father. And under tribe, it is written that our sister is Indian. As our mother had a Muslim name, there is no way you can tell from the birth certificate that there is any Gypsy blood in our family. But it was only much later that our sister and I became aware of things like that. So what is interesting in this testimony is the importance given to the conversion of the mother to Islam as a key aspect that allowed interracial wedlock. And with the complicity of the imam, we understand that the children were able to be registered as Indians. So I found other testimonies that recall similar situation and support the idea that religion affiliation played a central role. Most of the testimonies I found so far suggested that Muslim men were often open to exogamy as long as the wife converted to Islam, and that it was less often the case for Hindu or Sikh Indians whose customs were more restrictive regarding interethnic marriage. But the practice of marrying indigenous women was far from being restricted to former indentured workers and was actually also adopted by some middle-class Muslim merchants, Christian Goans, and in some cases, even Hindu traders. And interracial marriages were not systematically accepted or rejected by Indian communities. And I will argue that other factors than race, including religion here, but also communal customs or social class, came to define the boundaries within which these relationships took place. And I don't know if I'm running out of time, probably, but there is one other example I wanted to share with you. It's a case of Joseph Murumbi. So among the cases of mixed-race children born in the early years of Indian settlement, I found there is this prominent political figure of the history of modern Kenya, Joseph Murumbi. He was an activist in the intercolonial struggle who, after the independence in 1963, held the position of Minister of Foreign Affairs in the Republic of Kenya, and briefly the position of vice president. So Murumbi was born to a Goan merchant, a highly educated Christian and somehow westernized man, and a Maasai mother in 1911. His father came to East Africa in the end of the 19th century to work in the colonial administration, and once there he married the daughter of a Maasai chief, so Murumbi's mother. In his memoir, Murumbi recalled his childhood and presented his parents' marriage as something not exceptional and not socially disruptive. Well, he was initially registered as an Indian, he was nevertheless socialized in both Indian and Maasai communities. And as a child, he was sent to southern India to be educated in a Jesuit school, and he spent about more than 10 years there. And when he came back to Kenya, his parents were separated, and this is a story he wrote. He said that my father and I advice was very sound. He said, now my son, you have to come back and I can get a job, a good job. I can get you a good job. Oh, I can see my connection, my internet connection is not stable apparently. I hope you can still hear me. But you can probably read the text on the PowerPoint. Just let me know if I lost you. I hope not. Okay, I'm almost done. Anyway, so Murumbi is telling the story of like when he came back, instead of taking a job as an Indian in the colonial administration, as he could have done, he decided to change his racial identity or racial class and become a Maasai and identify himself with the Maasai community. And as his father suggested him to do. And of course, Murumbi's narrative is certainly romanticized. I mean, he's writing in the 70s. At the time, he's a political leader, and he also needs probably to promote some social cohesion and inter-ethnic tolerance. So, yeah. But it is still true that when he came back in Kenya in the early 30s, he insisted that the colonial administration change his racial status in order to be registered as a Maasai. And that's what I called his racial mobility. And this racial mobility should not be understood, in my view, in terms of racial identity, but maybe simply be in more pragmatic level, because in the 30s, although Indians benefited from certain privileges, like access to jobs in the colonial administration, only indigenous people were allowed to acquire land in the so-called native reserves. So it might have been a pragmatic choice. But what I'm trying here to show is that there is a discrepancy between, on one side, the white anxiety towards race mixing and the reality of East African and Indian people. They might not necessarily identify with those categories, but rather manage to navigate around them in their own interest. And we can read it as a form of resistance somehow. And I come to my conclusion. So to conclude, the study of interracial intimacy between Indian men and indigenous women allow us to consider two distinct perspectives on race within the colonial society. So first, British concern toward race mixing reveals the fragility of racial categories, while the existence of mixed race children became a tangible evidence of Indian permanent settlements in British East Africa and British inability to strictly control Indian mobility within the empire. And the second point is that the formation of Indian African unions was allowed or justified by social cultural elements, including religion, communal custom and class, rather than being determined by colonial racial categories. And I just want to add one more thing on this, is that I don't want to suggest that racial thinking was only a white problem, or that other populations were colorblind, or that Indian African relations were ideal and conflict-free, because this is not my point. In fact, many educated Indians also adopted certain colonial views and reiterated racial prejudices toward African people. So my point here is whether to say that interracial sexuality did not follow a strict scheme, but rather was negotiated more or less successfully among local and migrant communities, whose lives and communal belonging were at the same time altered by British colonial rule. Thank you. I hope I didn't, my internet connection was not too bad.
It was fine, Daphne, don't worry. Thank you very much. We have time for some questions. And I think everyone is going to write in the chat if they want to ask questions. So I'll just wait a moment to see if any come in. Otherwise, So yeah, just to encourage everybody to write in their questions. I'm still looking. If there are any questions, sorry, I'm having a problem. Here we are. I might ask one of Yair while we wait, and that is about actually what you said right at the beginning of your paper about Ireland and it not being comparable in some way. And I wondered if you could say a bit more about that, because in a way, by excluding Ireland from your analysis, which I find extremely interesting, you automatically then get to the idea of kind of race being really important in partition, right? Whereas actually in this particular settler colonial context, but if you looked at Ireland as well, in other words, if you'd done a comparison, because I think Ireland is, my understanding, particularly in the kind of, for the early modern period, so the pre-19th century, is actually the classic case of settler colonialism, really. It's kind of where a lot of the theory has actually been derived from. So, I mean, I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about why you think that comparison doesn't work, just to sort of, so I can understand a bit more clearly the argument about partition in Israel-Palestine. Thank you.
I mean, there's various differences, but the main difference is that you have Irish people voting for Westminster. It's part of the same, it's not only part of the same state, and that is also true for Algeria, but it's also, you have Irish people voting. Now, of course, it's very restricted. First, Catholics can't vote until 1829, and then afterwards they can vote, but it depends how wealthy you are. But still, there is a sense of citizenship. So in that sense, I think where you can say that there is a comparison, I would say that settlers agree, and I think you can look at the Ulster Unionists as settlers, they agree to partition when there's no other option. When their back is against the wall, they will agree to partition. That's what happens in Ireland. I think that's where you do see, Jews, the Zionists are ambivalent about partition in 1937, and by the 1940s, they understand that they're not going to get anything better. So they don't really want partition. I mean, it's, settlers do not want partition by definition. It's not their ideal solution. But so that's where I do see room for comparison. But I think when we see how is it even suggested, then I think we see it's very clearly because they're not considered white European settlers. It doesn't, if they were considered that, I very doubt that partition would ever have been suggested.
Thank you very much. Now, I gather we've got a bit of a problem with the Q&A feed. So James, it might just be easier if you then take over and ask the questions, because you've actually got the questions in front of you. Does that sound like a good idea?
Actually, it's just me, for some reason, I'm not permitted to put anything in the Q&A. So I just have a whole list of questions, but I don't want it to become the Renton show. So I'll just ask a couple of short ones. But the first one I had was to Jan, and I just wondered, we had discussions yesterday where perhaps we were thinking that there were lots of discussions by early modernists, and where it was suggested that perhaps modernists are being ahistorical in importing a late modern notion of race into early modernity and even into medieval history. But I wonder if we could go the other way in your case and ask whether the Nazi conflation of typhus with the Jew comes from this particular moment that you discuss and the experience of military occupation in Eastern Europe during the First World War. For Yair, I have so much to say and to ask, but I just don't really want to go on. But I just think that it's a fantastic contribution, and I really appreciate that you are working on this. It's excellent stuff. I suppose my only comment is a question is to sort of link Yai's paper with the paper by Daphne, and that is about the instability of racial categories. And because I've written an article myself that's been sitting in a drawer for far too long on the sort of relational model for understanding race in the British official mind, and how it's determined by context. And I talk about partition there, but it seems to me that there's a lot of ambivalence about Jews. And if we look at the case of the so-called East Africa offer that you mentioned, behind closed doors, there was a lot of ambivalence about the Jews' capacity to be settler colonialists, which fits in with what you're saying. But then there's all sorts of shifting sands going on in how ideas, and I just wonder to what extent Yaya and Daphne would say that the instability of racial categories is sort of, do they think particularly relevant to what they're talking about, and whether that's something specific perhaps to the early 20th century. Okay, that's me done.
Yeah, and do you want to start, and then we'll hand over to Yaya and then to Daphne?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. Thank you very much for the question. I do think, so we have to be, especially in this context, I think we have to be very careful about determinism and about teleological understandings of the history of anti-Semitism and so on. I would, in that context, refer very much to David Engel's work on how to approach anti-Semitism historically. In this particular case, I mean, there have been long-standing views of Jews as, associated with disease and so on. All this narrative about well poisoning and so on, and the attacks during the plague and so on. This very much relates to it. So it's a long-standing anti-Jewish trope that is key to a Christian European narrative about Jews in that context. So these understandings of these doctors and bureaucrats in the First World War, they don't come from nothing. So they build on this already existing anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish trope, and this shapes their worldview, and this shapes their interpretation of the data and of their experiences, and this is the way they view the East, basically. There, in connection to what of Nazi policies, Nazi ideas, and that, I think the idea of typhus becomes much more widespread in all European societies after the First World War. So we often, aside from this German case, so we always talk about the Spanish flu, but for example, there were 3 million people who died of typhus in the during the Russian Civil War following the First World War. So, and it becomes that being associated with the East and everything bad from the East, this becomes a major trope in not only German anti-Semitic, but also French and British thinking about that. And also in the United States, so the discussion about the closing of the ending of immigration of East Europeans in, I think, 1923, and effective from 1924, is very much, or this is an important part of this discussion. On a very practical level, many of those people who are playing a central role in German-occupied Eastern Europe during the First World War then later play a key role in the occupation of Eastern Europe under the Nazis. Gabriel Leo-Levitius, for example, makes a strong case about that in regard to Oberost, so the Baltics mainly, but also many others, like Gottfried Frey, the chief medical officer. He becomes a key figure in Nazi health policies in the 30s. And so there is a strong continuity, of course.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you, James. I think that is to say that it's relational. Actually, just that's it. That's what it is. Because if you put East European settlers in East Africa, they're white. They become white. I think part of the anxiety of white settlers in East Africa is that they don't want the Jews to come because they understand they will be treated like white settlers. That's what we know. It's true that there's ambivalence, etc., but the bigger story is that when Jewish settlers come to South Africa or North America, they're white. But when you put them in Palestine, it's not clear that they're white. Why they're not white there? Well, I think they're not European, let's put it there, because the relationship to the Arabs is different, because it's a different configuration vis-a-vis other diaspora Jewish communities, and because Palestine is where they came from. So that means that they are in a different kind of relationship, which means it's more ambiguous, but generally not understood at least in that historical moment. And I would say even today, to a large degree, not understood as a simple white European settler story. I think that is very much about the context rather than what they do, because, you know, I mean, in terms of what the settlers planned to do, it was very similar.
Okay, Daphne, might just slightly add something to James's question. I was just also wondering whether the kind of these categories of exclusion that you're describing, it's a huge question, so I don't feel you have to answer it all, but it's something I'm interested in. Do you think that what you're describing is particularly, not obviously exclusively, particularly British and particularly related to, you know, British East Africa? Or is there something more broadly related to kind of colonial labour mobility here that you know, so we might actually observe the same thing in other parts? At least let's just confine it to sort of Africa, colonial Africa. I'm thinking obviously about Italy in this respect, but I just wondered if you could say something a little bit like the broader significance of what you described beyond British East Africa.
Okay, thanks. I like the fact how, Wallace mention of the Uganda offer really reflects on my case on East Africa, because it's the same place in the same period, basically. But that's this, what you just said about the fact that the Jews will be treated as white. It's actually the same fear as, you know, the Indian coming and having the same rights as British citizens at that time in East Africa. And to start with maybe the question of James on the instability of racial categories, of course, this is central, and I think it's actually Anstoler who coined it like this thing, like the stability of colonial categories and the fluidity of their contents. It's like it come together. The category is really strict, but what's inside is really fluid. And in my case, of course, what I'm trying to show with this mixed race children's stories is exactly this. But the category here we'll see in my case are obviously first and foremost an imperial tool. And with this example at the end of Murumbi and what I call like this racial mobility, I think it's not only the fluidity of the content of the category, but I think I like the idea of reading it as a form of resistance of how colonized people actually manage to play around these categories. So, and it's something that I didn't have the space to develop during this presentation, but I think actually the case of Goan people, so people from Goa, and Goa was a Portuguese colony at that time, so they had a kind of particular status because they were not British subject as such. But what's interesting in the case of Goan people who migrated to East Africa is that they were really treated differently in terms of race according to who looked at them and in which conditions they were. And there is a testimony of actual President Roosevelt visiting East Africa, and saying it's how awkward he finds that the African population think that Goan people are actually white. He said something like that. And I think it's because Goan people were highly educated and somehow westernized, then they were sometimes perceived as white by the local population. And in other occasions, Goan people are labeled as Asians because the white settler doesn't actually want Goans to have the same right and privilege. So I think it's really parallel what Yair just said about the case of Jews, because it depends in which situation you don't perceive racial categories in the same way. And and for your question, Lucy, it's more complicated. Yeah, I don't know. It's a really broad question, and I think it's easier for me to talk about what I know, so my specific case of East Africa, and not trying to make a broad generalization. But I mean, of course, I think, and this is also something that has been said a lot during this last days in this conference, is that the way race is played in certain specific political case really, how can I say that, really has a purpose somehow, and it's always used by someone applied on a certain population. And I think, yeah, in the Italian case, obviously, the racialization worked in the same way, sort of, for what I know from Italian colonialism, than I can see in the British case.
Yeah, thank you very much. We've got a final question. I don't think there's any other questions that have come in. Yeah, James is asking everyone to come forward with the questions, but while he does, he has a question to all of you that I'd ask you to comment on, which is, what do you think, any of you, all of you, is different about race in the 20th century, specifically between the pre and post World War II period to the middle of the 20th century? What difference does the imperial context make to these discussions and these issues about race? In other words, yeah, how does empire change race? I hope I've represented James's question properly. So any of you, whoever wants to go first. Do any of you want to answer that question?
I can start. Yeah. So I think one thing I can think of, there's the debate now about whether Jews are indigenous to Palestine, Israel or not. And this is used increasingly in kind of pro-Israel public relations and on social media, that Jews are indigenous, right? Now, this is really interesting because in some way it's a rehashing of, you know, what I'm talking about, how the British understand Jews. But in other ways it isn't. I mean, Zionists never refer to themselves as native. You know, it was very clear that they're returning. They sense there's a historical return, but native was understood as, you know, inferior racial category, which they didn't want to be part of. By 2020, indigenous has a certain capital, certain social capital that you can make, and you can also counter the colonial kind of analysis. So in a way, that kind of the pride of being indigenous is something that is would not have occurred to Zionists in 1920, but it does occur to people now, and that shows how these things continue but also shift.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Daphne or Jan, do you want to add anything? It's not compulsory, but if you want to, please do. No?
I mean, I can quickly add something, but for me, in my case, in the case of my research, I think the switch is much more between the late 19th century and what I will say a more like naive definition of race, well, like the rise of eugenics and the popularization of scientific racism in the interwar period, that actually then came to define race in a much more effective way, if I can say, or is like based on scientific arguments. So I think in my case, I think this turn is essential, because in the interwar period you can justify segregation policies by saying that by basically using scientific arguments. So I think this transition is essential. This period transition is essential.
Okay, thank you very much. I think Justine Walden has a question, so James will unmute you.
Oh, hi. Wait. Should I? funny. I don't have the option to.
No, it's because James is controlling it. I think you can probably ask.
Okay. That's okay. I'm glad James is controlling things. So all I had to say, and this is not anything that anyone hasn't already said, is just that. So I come from the perspective of being an early modernist. I'm not a 19th centuryist or a 20th centuryist, and so it's clear to me from that perspective that the difference between the early modern period and the modern period is that racial categories are much more organized in the 20th century, and this feeds off of what James just said, which is that, or it's really a question. I'm wondering. So I know that the distinction is made, that the introduction of science and biology enters the picture and changes the way race is conceived of and defined in the modern world. But especially since I'm not a modernist, I wonder when that is. Now, James just mentioned the importance of World War I as being kind of a turning point. I'm sort of interested in, when it filters into popular consciousness. I'm always more interested in that. So anyone have any thoughts on that? It's not even my area. I'm just more curious.
Anyone would like to have a go at that question, answering that question?
Was that clear? Or no?
I think so. Yeah. And you want to speak?
Yeah, to rather make a comment on that. I think one side of that is how science changed the understanding of race. The other side of it is this, what I'm a bit working on, is how then race changed, or understandings of race changed science. And so this dialectical relation between those two aspects is something that I found absolutely fascinating. And I would say that, it's a long process, and I don't think that for contemporaries, or for most contemporaries, especially in Europe, in the areas that I'm working on, for example, East Central Europe, these categories are not so straightforward and so clear as it would be for ideologues and often for historians when they look back on it. So often they're much more fluid. But nonetheless, so I would say that throughout the 19th century and in the early 20th century, it becomes in this area, it becomes a key feature and a key way to view the world. To view the world through the lens of race, and through strongly connected to that, of course, through the lens of nation.
And what are the markers of that? How do you, that's a great statement, and I agree with it. But how do you trace that, and sort of, what's the evidence that you use to make those points?
So in my particular cases, for example, we can, we can look at whether people regard categories as changeable, and whether they derive something from people because they're identified as members of a particular race, this is one of the more, and one of the things that I find always incredibly telling is whether things in the natural world, so to say, like a disease, like a bacteria that doesn't care about you and me and anything, whether this is regarded to be connected to that, and other things as well, other things like basically of the natural world, because it's at this stage where race not only becomes an aspect of life, but becomes a way to view the world and to
That's really interesting. That's really interesting. And just to throw a monkey wrench into what you just said, I was just reading something last night from the 16th century where people are describing breeds of horses and how they are their races, and they're from different areas in mostly Italy, and how but in other parts of the world too, and they're really attributing sort of like cultural characteristics to the horses, according to their quote unquote races, which I thought was really, really interesting because it's so early. Anyway, it just sort of feeds on what you just said, how when people are sort of projecting onto the natural world, things onto the natural world.
Thank you very much, Justine. I think we're going to have to stop, unfortunately, because I think the next session is about to start at 6:30 my time and 5:30 UK time. Is that right, James? I think I'm right. I'm right. I've got the program in front of me. So it remains, I'll just check because I'm starting to know how to do it.
Sorry, I'm here now.
I'm right, aren't I, James?
We're having a break now. We're
We're
going to
gonna
have a
have a break now.
15-minute break. Yeah.
Okay, fine. But in the meantime, let me thank our 4 speakers very much for a fantastically stimulating set of papers, which I learnt a lot. So thank you. I'm sorry we can't all clap, but you know, there we go. Thank you so much. See you all in 15 minutes.
right? So we're seeing that, for example, the deeply problematic and fraught healthcare system that we. Hi, I'm Dr. Jean Beeman. I'm a sociologist and professor at the University of California in Santa Barbara, United States. And I conduct research on race and racism in both France and the United States. And based on my expertise and the research that I've conducted, I'm interested in COVID-19 for a variety of reasons, but also, namely, for what it reveals about how racism continues to structure American life and American society. Already, we've seen staggering levels of deaths of Black Americans across the country, disproportionate to their population and their makeup in the United States. And scarily, we've also seen, as other scholars have noted, a rise in surveillance capitalism, or in other words, using the tools of surveillance to continue to mark African Americans and also Latinos as suspect under the guise of protecting Americans from the coronavirus or the spread of the coronavirus. Like most things in capitalist societies, coronavirus.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the last panel. Now, can everyone hear me? Okay. And James, we starting now or are we waiting a bit? Let's begin. Okay. So, welcome to the last panel, the 20th and 21st centuries, in which we have three speakers who I'll introduce now. The first is Ben Bland. Ben is an historian of race, nationalism and extremism in the 20th century. He focuses chiefly, but not exclusively, on Britain. He teaches history at the University of Hertfordshire and at Queen Mary in London. He's published articles on immigrants and minorities, Patterns of Prejudice, and The Radical History Review. He's currently working on 2 further articles and his debut monograph, provisionally entitled The Anti-Fascist Nation, ? Race, Memory and Identity in Late 20th Century Britain. Then we have Ian Miller, who lectures in medical studies at Ulster University. He's the author of various monographs and articles on topics including the history of forced feeding, dietary change, the history of psychology and food history. He's currently the book review editor at the journal Social History of Medicine. And then finally, we have Ivan Kalmar, who's a professor of anthropology at the University of Toronto. Over his career, much of his work is focused on the image of Jews and Muslims in Western cultural history. He's the author of the book Early Orientalism, Imagined Islam, and the Notion of Sublime Power, and the co-editor of the book Orientalism and the Jews. He's recently guest edited a special issue of Patterns and Prejudice on Islamophobia in the East of the European Union, and a special issue on Islamophobia in Germany, East and West, for the Journal of Contemporary European Studies. He's currently conducting research on illiberalism in Central Europe under a 5-year grant from the Canadian Social Science and Humanities Research Council. And he's writing a book on this for Bristol University Press. So without further ado, we hand over to Benjamin, and I would appreciate everyone keeping to time. And that's, of course, a nudge from James, which I'm passing on to you. The floor is yours, Ben.
Thank you, Dirk, and thanks, James, and everyone for organising this. I'm hoping you can now all see my screen. Do shout at me if that's not the case. I've jazzed up my title a little bit. I'm still mainly talking about historiography here. And in some ways, I suppose what I want to do here today is make quite a broad, but also quite simple. And to those of you who are already kind of really familiar with the literature on fascism, it might not even be that exciting, a historiographical point. But the chief thing I want to sort of emphasize today is my belief that historical understandings of fascism have actually been insufficiently concerned with challenging the idea of race, by which I effectively mean race as an essentialized construct that acts as a force of division in our politics and in our societies. For the purposes of extra clarification, when I talk about fascism here, I'm essentially referring to a radical ideology that uncompromisingly promotes national and or racial rebirth as a solution to perceived crises of cultural and social decline or decadence. So I'm not focusing strictly on Italian fascism, and I'm not confining fascism to the pre-1945 period either. I'll focus on broad trends, and so I'm not going to spend 15 minutes trying to speed through a critical examination of the enormous historiography of fascism, which I'm sure is a relief to absolutely everyone listening to this. Instead, I'm going to try and do 3 things in the time available to me. Firstly, I'm actually going to outline the particular historical context in which my research engages with the matter at hand. I'm going to do this partly in order to help indicate why I think these issues are important, but I also think it might be beneficial in setting up the sort of historical questions that are useful in our present moment when trying to center race in analyses of fascism. Then I will talk for a little bit about the academic historiography of fascism, highlighting what exactly some of my problems with it might be. And last but not least, I'll very briefly in my conclusions point to some other works that touch upon fascism from different perspectives and suggest how they may indicate routes forward and help us understand how historical writing about fascism can center race. So I'm currently working on what, I hope will be my first book. I mean, like everything when you're a precarious academic, that's sort of up for change, but hopefully. It's an extension of my PhD, and it focuses on the social, cultural, and political meaning of fascism in late 20th century Britain. And it stems in many ways from being a young adult at the time in which Nick Griffin, pictured here, was leading the British National Party, which was briefly surging in popularity in the sort of early to mid-2000s in Britain. Now, this was a neo-fascist political party led by someone with a long history of promoting Holocaust denial and overt racism. And what always fascinated me about it, and not just me, I don't think, but was the way this party claimed to promote a very standardized British patriotism, so indicated here by Griffin standing a pint of bitter in hand in front of a backdrop in which the BNP celebrate VE Day, i.e. the day that the Second World War ended in Europe and Nazi Germany was defeated. At the same time, however, this was a party that endorsed a politics that seemed to be completely counter to the values, tolerance, openness, freedom, equality, anti-racism, and more specifically, perhaps anti-fascism, that are widely considered to be embedded in popular perceptions of British national identity. Now, these popular mythologies are something that numerous authors, not least this afternoon's keynote speaker, Kennetta Hammond Perry, have dismantled effectively, but they are still commonly accepted throughout British society and perhaps beyond. So over time, I became interested in how such contradictions could come about. And in my ongoing work, I'm looking to interrogate the role that British conceptions of fascism have played in how society has remembered and absorbed its own history, as well as how it has thought through ideas of race and national identity. Because of this, whilst I'm interested in fascism as an ideology and as a set of sorry, my PowerPoint seems to be updating very slowly, but it is coming through. Because of this, while I am interested in fascism as an ideology and set of beliefs, I'm more interested in it as a signifier and as a discursive construct, as something that casts a long shadow over post-war history and which shapes our present in ways that extend well beyond the realms of ideology. I believe that in order to confront the political racisms and reflections of fascism that we see ever more frequently haunting our contemporary societies, we need to spend more time thinking about it in these terms. And I also fervently believe that fascism is far from the only form of racialized nationalism. And so I feel that one of our tasks when studying fascism needs to be to try and understand how it relates more specifically to other doctrines, both liberal and illiberal, that exclude groups on a racialized basis. Therefore, when we learn about fascism, whether in its historic regime guises or in its post-war subcultural or fringe states, we need to take care not to study it in isolation, but to ensure that we are also simultaneously paying very careful attention to the social, cultural, political, and economic conditions that it reflects and is also an articulation of. Now, these latter 2 points in particular will, I hope, contextualize the historiographical complaint, for want of a better term, that I'll now discuss in a little bit more detail. And I should note here that partly for the purposes of time, whilst I think the points I'm making are broadly true of popular history and memory, as well as of the wider academic literature, I'm really focusing here quite specifically on the academic historiography of fascism as an ideology, essentially on the cross-disciplinary subfield that is now known as fascist studies. And so I think the points I'm making are still true with regard to a lot of national case study histories. And I think the literature on British fascism would be a good case in point, but I'm not focusing on these histories here. So those of you familiar with the literature on fascism will know that it's huge and that it has since the early 1990s in particular acquired a particular focus on proposing and comparatively testing theorizations of what fascism actually is as a generic political phenomenon. I do not seek to deny this is something that has enormous value. Fascism is of course a body of ideas and must be understood in order to be combated. But I would stress that this focus on defining fascism has not always produced a corresponding degree of curiosity about the concepts upon which fascist ideas and practice have been based. I actually think in many cases this could be seen as true in regard to the nation as well as in regard to race, but obviously today I'm sticking to the latter. And to illustrate my point, I'm going to focus briefly on a trio of works that I think represent three strands in the broader literature. So that's Roger Griffin's The Nature of Fascism. This is the book that could be seen to have done most of all to kickstart fascist studies, with a focus on offering a culturalist and ideational definition of generic fascism. Robert Paxton's The Anatomy of Fascism, which blends the focus on ideas with a bit more consideration of political action and contextual factors. And David Renton's Fascism, Theory and Practice, which is rooted far more in the Marxist tradition and is relatively dismissive of the notion that fascism can be truly understood by a focus on its actual ideological content. Now, I fully recognise that there are many, many more subtleties to this historiography that can be conveyed by focusing on these three works, and there are more recent works on fascism that do make some important advances against the critiques I'm sort of making. I'm thinking, for example, of the attempts by Benjamin Zachariah and Federico Finkelstein to critique the abiding Eurocentrism of much of this historiography. But I think for the purposes of what I'm trying to do today, that these three works can still be seen as offering a useful shorthand for the most significant tendencies. So how do these authors deal with race? Well, to be frank, in my view, they do not. Each of them refers to race at various junctures, although none of them devote any significant amount of attention to its construction as a category of difference. On one level, this is understandable. These authors are writing about fascism, something which can be difficult to encapsulate, and not about race, something which we might say is even more difficult to encapsulate. Nonetheless, to my mind at least, the ways in which race is referred to make this lack of attention slightly problematic. So Paxton, for instance, emphasizes that fascist leaders have always wanted to, quote, bring their people into a higher realm of politics, end quote, in which they would, quote, experience the warmth of belonging to a race now fully aware of its identity, historic destiny, and power. I think we might say that race is accepted a little too easily here as a potentially transcendent, quasi-spiritual concept, rather than something that needs to be carefully considered and explained. Perhaps this is even more apparent in the way Griffin deals with race. So Griffin contends that, quote, fascism is essentially racist, end quote, albeit not necessarily in a biological and eliminationist sense. Fascist racism can, he suggests, quote, remain within the bounds of the common or garden racism, which was so pervasive in European societies, liberal or otherwise, at the turn of the century, end quote, without turning into either what he terms racial persecution, which is not particularly defined, or systematic genocide. Now, neither Paxton nor Griffin show any particular interest in digging deeper into the precise work that race is doing in their analyses of fascism, or in exploring precisely how race was actually constructed in the fascist imaginary. In fact, the extent to which works in this historical subgenre interrogate race regularly stops at the sort of differentiation that Griffin identifies. And when it goes further, it is often to make somewhat, potentially at least, misleading assertions about the historical evolution of race as a concept. So Paxton, for instance, briefly argues that until it was, quote, given a more explicitly biological and hereditarian form in the late 19th century, end quote, race was little more than, quote, a rather neutral term for any animal or human grouping, end quote. Now, for all this could just about be said to be true of race as a linguistic term, or even perhaps as an organizing principle, I think it's also a slightly jarring assurance to make, given how we can see race as being conceptually significant in the histories of colonialism and of slavery, amongst other examples. Now, this tendency to see race less as a socially generated construct designed to demarcate the other, and more as a relatively innocent linguistic term that then became a deviant scientific concept, has significant implications. Most damaging, I feel like it can cast fascist racial prejudice and violence as enabled chiefly by eugenics and other unpleasant developments in the sciences, thus effectively, if not necessarily always intentionally, disconnecting it from the longer term patterns of segregation and genocidal violence carried out by European colonial empires. One crucial impact of this separation of racisms or understandings of race is that the difference between common or garden racism and racial persecution becomes overstated. So the former was not hermetically sealed off from the racial hierarchization that was central to imperialism, a state of affairs that would conveniently enable us to see the racial ideals of fascism as somehow distinct and separate from the actions of colonial powers. Now, this separation has been a common feature of the problematic popular as well as academic misunderstandings of fascism. Renton's work in the Marxist tradition has a little bit more to offer here. Sorry, I have seen that there seems to be a message in the chat. I'm not sure if that's for me, but I can't actually see it. It's not coming up. So apologies if that's something that I'm ignoring. I think I'm doing just about okay for time. Now, Renton's work in the Marxist tradition has a little bit more to offer here. For instance, by engaging, albeit briefly, with critiques of the British Empire as being essentially fascist, although it's perhaps worth noting that he quotes George Orwell here rather than, say, George Padmore. He can also be given credit for placing more emphasis on the ways in which fascist practice uses racism to target the vulnerable in society and prey upon communities disenfranchised by capitalism. Renton does implicitly argue for a disavowal of race, albeit not unexpectedly for a Marxist author, by promoting a regenerated form of class solidarity. He stops short of any more sustained attempt at deconstruction and, like Paxton and Griffin, provides relatively little in the way of a direct challenge to fascist interpretations of race. Now, that our focus when we study fascism tends to remain fairly narrowly on either its doctrines or its deeds is, I think, a significant part of the problem here. In essence, fascism's identification of the people with the race is presented as just something that fascists often say or do in order to promote their brand of extremism. Race is only really acknowledged as a construct here, insofar as we recognize it as something applied to society by fascists. But it is a largely exclusionary construct inculcated in our societies over centuries, and that this is an absolutely central prerequisite to the existence of fascist regimes is, by comparison, barely touched upon. Even less of an acknowledged concern is the risk that this inculcated racial prejudice, this common or garden racism, may be reproduced in writings that do little to directly challenge it. And this overarching tendency reflects the fact that whilst the historiography of fascism plays attention to the context in which fascism has emerged, it often veers away from what I would argue is the most pressing question we must ask of fascism. What does it tell us about societies in which it is present, or latterly, but it has helped shape? To generalize, I think we can say that perhaps fascism's most fundamental and abhorrent revelation is that it provides a violent demonstration of what Alana Lentin refers to as the, quote, interrelationships between the consolidation of a political idea of race and the exigencies of the modern European state, end quote. In other words, an alternative historiography of fascism could be animated not by providing a critique of fascism in and of itself, but of fascism as an expression of a racialized construction of the nation state, as racialization enacted in an especially brutal manner. Seen through this lens, the history of fascism remains a history of aberration, but one that more openly and rigorously accepts the horrific potentialities of fascism as within all our societies, past and present. So moving forward, and this is my conclusion, I propose that the historiography of fascism needs to go out of its way to consciously connect with other histories and perspectives. I mentioned George Padmore briefly earlier. He's at the center of a brilliant chapter on interpretations of colonial fascism in Priyam Vadagopal's recent Insurgent Empire. We could think carefully about how anti-colonialism, not just colonialism, can further reorient our understanding of fascism. Fascism plays a central role in much of Paul Gilroy's work, but most of all perhaps in his attempts to craft a planetary humanism, as he calls it, in between camps or against race, as I believe it's titled in the US, a work that I've scarcely seen addressed at all in histories of fascism, despite it being over 15 years old now. What does the history of fascism look like if we see it as but one manifestation of the camp-based thinking that divides humanity and promotes oppression through race? Finally, I could also point to various innovations from Holocaust and comparative genocide studies. And the one that always comes first to my mind is Michael Rothberg's work on multidirectional memory, in which he emphasizes, amongst other things, how the legacy of the Holocaust can play a key role in empowering the voices of those oppressed by imperial and post-imperial forms of European colonial power. In his work, Rothberg works against assumptions that, quote, a straight line runs from memory to identity, and that the only kinds of memories and identities that are therefore possible are ones that exclude elements of alterity and forms of commonality with others, end quote. I believe that in the case of fascism more generally, Rothberg's point can scarcely be highlighted enough. We destroy fascist racism when we center it and deconstruct it, not just for the benefit of the historical victims of fascism, but in order to deconstruct race in our societies for the benefit of victims of racial prejudice everywhere. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Ben. Now we have Ian Miller, who is going to speak to us about his paper entitled Race, Self-Esteem and Black Political Activism, 1940s to the 1970s. The floor is yours, Ian Miller. Can't hear you, Ian.
Hello, is that better?
Yes.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, I presume everyone can hear me. Sorry about that. Yeah, this paper stems from a broader project which kind of looks at the politics of self-help and how different activist groups have used theories like psychological theories of self-help within the different agendas, whether that's the feminist movements, LGBT communities, and in this instance, I'm going to focus obviously on Black political activists in the 1960s specifically. I won't go on too much about the broader project, but what I would like to think about today is maybe the role of maybe psychology and emotions in understanding the history of racism, and to focus on that aspect of things. I'll argue that for a relatively brief period in the late 1960s, ideas about self-esteem became central to the collective aims of radical Black activists who framed things like building self-confidence and self-respect almost as a promising psychological weapon with which to challenge white racism in America specifically. My main argument being that racism became framed in relation to the politics of the mind and the emotions. Obviously, that's a very different approach to maybe advocating social and economic change. It suggests, that activism can come from within. First and foremost, one of the main themes I'll discuss is the idea of so-called Negro inferiority was a term used until around the 1960s. The idea of inferiority being used earlier in kind of initiatives like eugenics, of course, which had framed African Americans as kind of culturally or biologically inferior to white people. After the Second World War, psychology is increasingly influential and popular, and it isn't long before psychologists begin to caricature African American communities as also being emotionally or psychologically weaker or inferior as well. So I'm going to be looking at how these ideas were perpetuated, but also how different African American communities and particularly activist groups responded to these claims and theories, and actively in some cases used them or harnessed them or rejected them, or used them in various specific ways. I think the psychological theories were mainly produced by white people, mostly men, but also some African American men as well. Even when they were sympathetic to racism in African American communities, I think they still helped to produce a certain caricature of what some people at the time called the damaged Negro personality. This was a kind of emotionally hindered personality, kind of set back by feelings of inferiority complexes, low self-esteem. A lot of this work came from Stonquist's ideas of the marginal man, developed in the 1930s. This was a sociological theory which kind of suggested that if you're the subject of racism, you might internalize the hostile attitudes of others towards you and begin to view yourself with loathing. And Stonquist main idea is that one of his ideas is this shock when the marginal man realizes he doesn't belong to a community is quite emotionally damaging. One of the most popular and well-known books of this category is The Mark of Oppression by Gardner and Ovesey, first published in 1951. Gardner and Ovesey describes social discrimination as an ever-present and unrelieved irritant, painful in its intensity, which hindered the African American's ability to, in their words, maintain internal balance and to protect himself from being overwhelmed by it. This is a remarkably influential book. It used psychodynamic and personality approaches to social problems, racism specifically, again helping to change the trajectory, I think, of discussion of racism at the time. It looks more towards the effects of racism on people's emotional lives, rather than moving forward from maybe the earlier eugenics approach, which would often focus on basically on the matter of racial difference. But the book was not intended to be racist in any ways, but it ultimately offered readers quite depressing images of African American personality, people hindered by their inferiority complexes, and as some critics have argued, the Mark of Oppression remained quite ethnocentric in nature in its construction of African American personalities. Psychologists also became interested around the 1950s and 60s in the idea of African Americans passing as white people. Earlier research to focus on the social and economic advantages of this. So obviously being able to pass as a white person might help you to secure a job, which may not have been on offer to you. In contrast, post-war psychologists portray passing more as a psychological defense mechanism, and again as a telltale sign of self-hatred and self-rejection, a deep-rooted psychological desire to become white. So we can see here that psychologists are very much reframing racism in different ways at this time. Of course, all of this could be interpreted as mostly as whites gazing on blacks and pathologizing blackness, perhaps confirming the subliminal racist tendencies. So the white body in these studies was fixed as normative, and the African American body almost as pathological, and also the mind as well. Perhaps the most famous in time when black self-esteem was discussed publicly occurred in the mid-1950s when Kenneth B. Clark, who's pictured here on the screen, prepared a paper on the effects of school segregation on children's self-esteem in the heavily discussed Brown versus Board of Education decision of 1954. And Clark did conclude that African American self-esteem was indeed damaged by segregation, which points to the findings of historians such as Alan Herman, who again uses this in examples to say how the terms and discussion of racism was being reorientated towards psychologies and emotions. It was a time as well when an African American psychologist actively used the negative models of Black emotional life circulating at the time to offer firm evidence that racism was indeed psychologically damaging. One of the, I think, the keynotes earlier discussed ideas of victimhood. And again, I think in this instance, it's a good example of how this sense of victimhood was kind of played upon and used for the purposes of civil rights. Clark continued to publish works and ideas on the psychological life of African Americans. So this is a quote for the 1965 book, Dark Ghetto, Dilemmas of Social Power. And he writes, human beings were forced to live under ghetto conditions and whose daily experiences tells them they are almost nowhere in society are they respected and granted the ordinary dignity and courtesy accorded to others will begin to doubt their own worth. And he continues by saying, since every human being depends upon experiences with others for clues as to how he should view and value himself, children who are consistently rejected began to doubt whether they, the family, and their group deserve any respect. So this, of course, is a reference to self-esteem, then quite a new concept being used in psychological circles. Towards the end, Clark discusses the complex and debilitating prejudices which African Americans begin to have against themselves, and he laments the preoccupation with hair straighteners, skin bleachers, and the like. Again, I think a reference to perhaps to passing, but also this belief that African American people secretly desired to become white. And he says Negroes have come to believe in their own inferiority. I think you can read from this as one paper discussed earlier, the works of Frantz, who redefined racism and discussed it almost in terms of psychological colonization, so forms of racism in which identity, rather than freedom or economic success or political rights, was being denied quite actively, according to Clark. So Clark did present, again, African American life from a more pathogenic perspective, but still I think this caricature of negative African American emotional life still remained in place. But other trends in research were suggesting more complexity and more diversity as well in African American emotional experience. If you read the psychological texts at the time, it appears that kind of Black personalities are formed almost entirely by experiences of racism and discrimination. The idea that there might be a lot of diversity doesn't really come out at all in the earlier psychological texts. It's only really from the 1960s when more complex models and research is developed. So on the left here, there's an image of Charles Keel. His book, Urban Blues. Keel was an anthropologist, and he went out to look at blues music in the 1960s and quickly came to the conclusion that psychologists, and Cardinal and Oversey in particular, with the emphasis on lives of crime and broken homes, have been far too pessimistic And he wrote, if the authors had left their offices and gone out into the communities, this question might well have been avoided. And similarly, in 1971, two sociologists, Maurice Rosenberg and Robert Simmons, published a landmark study called Black and White Self-Esteem, the Urban Schoolchild. Much to their surprise, they found that the self-esteem of African American communities was about the same as white ones. And the authors described this as a puzzle, which they could not explain. Obviously, the politics of race were multifaceted. To some extent, it suited African Americans to claim that their self-images and personality development have been damaged in the past. And for this helped to, well, supported their view about the evils of racism. But at the same time, this didn't leave much scope for empowerment. So at the time, Black activists in particular, I think, begin to redefine kind of perceptions and theories of their own emotional well-being. And we see this particularly in the Black Power movement as well. Some members of this claimed that it was racist whites who were in fact sick and pathological, not the victims. Again, we can see the influence of psychoanalytical interpretations of racism here once again. And the Black Panthers were particularly interested in kind of self-help techniques and sought to nurture Black pride and self-determination. The idea, you know, that African American people should develop a more empowered personality, and that would be the basis of emancipation, was very evident in their work. They urged people to reject white culture and call for a new consciousness amongst African Americans based upon pride and not shame. And they refer directly to works such as The Marginal Man, which I mentioned earlier, to argue that African American self-esteem had historically been lowered by white racism primarily, but encouraged African Americans to redefine racial representations on their own terms and in more positive and empowering ways. So in their words, they sought to establish a viable psychological, political and social base upon which the Black community can function to meet its needs. So again, we've got this idea of racism being challenged and tackled by changing one's inner perceptions of oneself. There was one African-American psychologist who was kind of very engaged with the Black Panthers and Black Power movements of the late 1960s, and that was Alvin Toussaint. He conceded that many African Americans had once suffered from a poor, tarnished self-image, self-destructive attitudes, and harmful emotional behavior. But he blamed white Americans for, in his words, internalizing and socializing African Americans to internalize and believe all the many vile things that white people were saying about them. And he goes back to this discussion of hair and straighteners and bleaching creams and those kind of things. And he views these as kind of white weapons as such. And he encourages African Americans to adopt their own natural styles. And the Afro in particular is much discussed in the late 1960s as a kind of symbol, I guess, of Black pride and a newfound Black confidence, which is emerging towards the end of the 1960s. So her was particularly politicized as well, but I think it says a lot as well, the Afro, about the ways in which African Americans were being encouraged to adjust their mindsets and their emotional mindsets in particular, and their attitudes towards themselves. I think I might be running out of time a little bit, but just to sum up, it's evident that Black political activism in the late 1960s was driven, I feel, by a strong sense of psychological rehabilitation, which was intended to complement all the other work being done in terms of social and political change. I mean, some historians have criticized this in some ways for encouraging kind of African Americans to look inwards upon themselves and to not pay as much attention to kind of broader social, economic, and political factors that might be worth tackling more directly. Okay, well, thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Ian. Also for keeping to time. That means there's more time for discussion shortly. Finally, we have Professor Ian Kalmar, whose paper is entitled Degrees of Race, Whiteness as a Quantity in Perceptions of Eastern Europe. Over to you, Ian. Can't hear you, mate.
Just a moment.
That's good.
I'd like to thank James Renton and all the other organizers of this amazing conference. My talk is the last regular talk before the presentation that we're looking for later today. So I think a lot of people might be tired, but I promise that I'm going to be keeping to my time and also do a user-friendly presentation. And so I've changed the title of my talk to be a little more user-friendly, and it's called Eastern Europeanism, a Racism of Degree. On the 14th of October 2007, a Polish construction worker came to Canada to join his mother and start a new life. His plane landed at the Vancouver International Airport at 3:14 p.m. His papers were in order, but immigration officials took their time processing them. By the time Robert Jakanski was allowed out into the baggage area, it was well over midnight. He became agitated. At one point, he threw a computer to the floor. The police were called to the scene. They fired their taser guns at him, and he began to convulse. As he fell to the ground, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers continued to taser him. Their actions caused a heart attack, and Jakanski died. A subsequent inquiry found that the officers acted inappropriately. Some were convicted of lying about how dangerous the Eastern European migrants' actions had been, but no one was charged with murdering him. Josef Kovanec, a Slovak traveler, boarded a plane at the Charleroi airport in Belgium on the 23rd of February, 2018. The 39-year-old, who suffered from episodes of mental illness, reportedly became violent before takeoff. At 7:30 p.m., the captain called the police, and a doctor approved placing Kovanec in a cell where he was at first allowed to sleep. A video shows officers entering at about 4:30 a.m. They proceed to bind the man's hands and feet. Soon, as many as 7 officers are seen in the cell. One applies pressure to his neck, another kneels on his chest for about 16 minutes. A policewoman presents a mock Nazi salute. Smiles on the other officers' faces show they're quite amused. Initial reports said that Kovanec died in hospital a little later, but his lawyer and family maintain that he was dead on arrival. At the time of writing, a court investigation is still going on. Kovanec's wife, Henrietta, saw a parallel to the well-known death of an African-American choked to death under the knee of a white policeman this summer. Quote, after the videos of the arrest of the American George Floyd, unquote, and quote again, I immediately thought, my husband died the same way. Except that the police also laughed out loud at my husband, and the policewoman next to him did a Hitler salute. How right was Kovanec's wife to compare the police brutality towards her husband to one of the most notorious cases of police killing a Black man in America? Would Jakanski and Kovanec still be alive today if they were not a Pole and a Slovak? Like we must surmise, Floyd would be alive had he not been an African American. Would they be alive if they were not Eastern European? The dismayed comparison made by Henrietta Kovanec appears to be one of the rare cases in which the public outside of academia allows that something like white racism may also target people with white skin. For ordinary folks, pigment guarantees that you're either white or not. Scholars increasingly take a different view. For some time now, many have argued that some groups that are generally called white have acquired their whiteness only in relatively recent history. The most talked about examples are those of the Irish and the Jews. In contrast with the Irish and the Jews, Eastern Europeans have been becoming less, not more white. Research conducted by a number of scholars, including as yet unpublished work by myself, shows Eastern Europeans feeling targeted by Western prejudice. A racism I like to call Eastern Europeanism ascribes a civilizational difference to the whole huge post-communist space in Eurasia. Worrisome yet premature reports declare liberal democracy to be a failed foreign import, and in all, not just some of the area. They blame an alleged cultural heritage of obscurantism, including racism, anti-Semitism, sexism, and homophobia, and a whole complex of attitudes that are considered culturally incompatible with Western values and political structures. Now, just for the record, reports of the death of liberal democracy in all of Eastern Europe are premature, as is uniform despair about its economic status and moral standards. Even Orban's authoritarianism is not Putin's violent repression. It's hard to get a mail order bride from Estonia or the Czech Republic, as you can from Ukraine, or to have someone sell you a kidney in Croatia, as you can in Moldova. Poland is not Belarus or even Kazakhstan. To lump all of these places together as a vast European basket case is a textbook example of cultural racism as defined by Tariq Modood, quote, all or nearly all of a group identified by color and descent are being judged by an essentialized image of a group, unquote. Nearly all is important because an understanding of race as a quantity or a racialization of degree opens up the possibility that some in the racialized group will manage to gather more white privilege than others. Though glass ceilings remain even for the rich and the educated who are not white, racism more severely impacts the poor and the uneducated. Privilege attaches not only to race, but to other things such as class. A person may well feel rather unprivileged in spite of being white. Recognizing that this is so, Nassar Mir recently gave a memorable informal definition of white privilege. He noted that life was not necessarily easy for white people, but, quote, being white doesn't make life harder, unquote. Being Eastern European makes life harder. Being Eastern European makes life harder because an Eastern European is white, but not quite. The conception of a whiteness of degree recommends recalling Homi Bhabha's writing in the 90s on being, quote, the same, but not quite, unquote. Bhabha shows how Western supremacy in the colonial and post-colonial context hinges on non-Western elites becoming almost an integral part of the West, but at the same time depends on maintaining the difference between East and West. Equality is promised, but delayed forever. Perhaps the saddest irony of the history of liberal democracy is that the states where liberal democracy has been most secure are the imperial powers on both sides of the North Atlantic, who've combined the increasing democratic empowerment of their own public with the domination of territories where democratic freedoms were denied. Colonial populations were seen mainly as a source of cheap labor and a market for cheap Western products. This two-faced character of Western imperial power, that it grants democracy to its own but denies it to those under its economic or political sway, survives, as many observers have noted, into the post-colonial period. Colonial discourse appears to demand that the colonized become like the colonizer, but in practice insists that this must not happen, that a difference between colonizer and colonized must be maintained. This is required to maintain the centering of wealth in the West. It's an example supporting Geraldine Heng's approach, which views racialization as a sorting out mechanism to ensure a distributive hierarchy. Baba describes the frustration of the post-colonial intellectual who acquires the culture and many of the credentials of the white elite, but not its full acceptance. Instead, their acculturation is rejected as mimicry. Colonial mimicry, says Baba, is, quote, the desire for a reformed, recognizable other as a subject of a difference that is almost the same, but not quite, which is to say that the discourse of mimicry is constructed around an ambivalence. In order to be effective, mimicry must continually produce its slippage, its excess, its difference, unquote. The same logic exists in the relationship between the Euro-American West and post-communist Eastern Europe. If the barrier to whiteness for the South Asian elite, whom Baba must have had in mind, was color of skin, the obstacle to full white privilege for Eastern Europeans is alleged cultural heritage. Western discourses that isolate Eastern Europe beyond the solid cultural barrier serve a purpose. They avoid recognizing the decisive Western contribution to how Eastern Europe is today. They obscure the role of Western capital in the 90s and early 2000s, marked by neoliberalism and globalization. These strategic, discursive mechanisms of racializing Eastern European failure are shared by or alleged Eastern European failure, are shared by academic, political, and popular culture discourses alike. Soon after 1989, as Western disappointment with the East was being increasingly culturalized, some scholars entertained a thought that had never occurred to Churchill, namely that the Cold War Iron Curtain had only replaced an imagined divide of a much longer date, perhaps going back to the Enlightenment. Among the academic works that appeared in the 90s to eternalize and essentialize the imagined East-West difference, perhaps the most celebrated example was Larry Wolff's The Invention of Eastern Europe, 1996. It weaves a single tapestry of Enlightenment vistas of Eastern Europe from a rich repertoire of good yarns. But does Casanova's tale of purchasing a sex slave from her father in Russia really have that much to do with the story of Mozart riding a coach to Prague and inventing funny names for his companions, which to Wolff sound Slavic? Casanova, who spent the last 18 years as a librarian near Prague, wrote his memoirs there, but recalled little there that Wolff could use. The adventurer's recollections are much concerned with national character, race perhaps we might say, but there is no distinctive unity in his ode to anything we might call Eastern Europe. I will admit that there are antecedents to the discourse of East-West difference in Europe, such as, for example, the important imagined contrast between Germans and Slavs. The difference does kick in after World War II with force, but the rise in racializing stereotypes after 1989 is remarkable. Most Western films of the late part of the Cold War presented amid the general communist gloom on the other side, glamorous women and capable cooperative men as well. The enemy, it turns out in most of them, was not the USSR, but some murky third force like the Bond movie's Spectre. Today, that picture of Eastern Europe has been entirely replaced by a grotesque parade of corrupt politicians, gangsters, and prostitutes. The grace with which Soviet chess players in the wonderfully retro Netflix series Queen's Gambit accept defeat by a young American woman in the elegantly stern confines of a dimly lit Grand Hotel can only be imagined in a time past. It's unthinkable in Western screen representations of the Russians and Eastern Europeans of today. The excellent suits worn by the show's debonair Soviet chess masters can be imagined in representations of post-communist Russia, but only on crime-tinged oligarchs. The denial of privilege to the white but not quite of Eastern Europe follows the colonial pattern of excluding the racialized other. In Bhabha's words, quote, the ambivalence of colonial authority repeatedly turns from mimicry, a difference that is almost nothing but not quite, to menace, a difference that is almost total but not quite. Those affected do not take the menace lying down, which does not mean that they'll necessarily turn to progressive means of fighting it. Eastern Europeans, like some whites in the poorer and more rural areas of the West itself, are particularly affected. Many consider it scandalous that their limited white privilege should fail to purchase them class privilege. The result is an assertion among much of the nationalists in the region that Eastern Europe is the last true bastion of real Western values, read white privilege. This claim that Eastern Europe will make Europe European again is readily supported by far-right admirers in the West who agree that immigrants of color have already destroyed their part of the world. And thus, the wrangling for morsels of white privilege between East and West in Europe adds to all the rest that in the post-communist, post-globalization, post-Trump world makes you want to cry. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ian. 3 terrific papers now, plenty of food for thought. Here comes my video. And now it's over to all of us to keep the discussion going with some scintillating questions in the Q&A. Now, let me open that up. So there's a question from Jan Ryback. I'll just read it out, makes it easier. Thanks very much for great and inspiring talks, exclamation mark. A question to Ben. When we aim to understand race in fascist ideology, do you think it's possible to discuss this eliminatory anti-Semitism of the Nazis and the racial policies of, for example, pre-1943 Italian fascism, the BNP in the 1990s, together in one frame? Some scholars would argue that this is qualitatively so different that it cannot be conceptualized together. Would be great to get your thoughts on that. And a question to Ivan. What would, in your approach, be the difference between the concept of Eastern Europeanism, as you seem to use it, I hope I've understood you correctly here, and anti-Slavism with this long-standing tradition of racial and nationalist discrimination and persecution in Europe and beyond? Why not use the traditional term for the analysis? Much of the anti-East European and historically anti-communist imaginations build so much on older traditions of Western anti-Slavic racial thinking. So over to first Ben and then to Ivan.
Thanks, Dirk, and thanks for the question, Jan. I mean, I'll try and be really brief in responding. Yeah, I think you can, but I think you also have to have lots of subdivisions within that, in the same way that I would, argue that we can compare different varieties of fascism. I think Nazism and Italian fascism are pretty radically different in various ways, under the same kind of overall framework. What I would say is that the clear separation that I would still accept within this kind of, landscape of fascist racism that I'm talking about here is that there is clearly some differentiation between, the systematic genocidal policies pursued by the Third Reich ultimately, and the racisms that are implicit in all other fascisms. Now, my potential sort of caveat even to that would be that if all fascist organizations had the same level of power and ability to sort of live out their racial ideas, then maybe there wouldn't be quite so much of a difference. But that's kind of getting almost into the realms of the counterfactual. So I think you can, but with qualifications. And it sort of depends a little bit on the kind of particular sort of questions you're trying to ask. I think from a point of view of deconstructing fascist racism, it's something that you can definitely do. It maybe becomes different if your focus becomes more on the kind of genocidal implications of fascism, I guess. I hope that's a relatively brief thing that does answer your question in some way. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much for that interesting question. I'm actually struggling with something like your question already, because it's certainly the case that Eastern Europeanism, as I call it, revives tropes of anti-Slavism, and possibly also is a linear successor of anti-Slavism. I mean, that's actually raises some interesting historical questions. But also there's a lot of difference. So, for example, those tropes that I mentioned of the prostitute and the gangster, we can't find them in anti-Slavism. So it is not something generated by the same struggles and conditions that anti-Slavism was in the 19th century, which was about the control of territory and political power in Central Europe. This time, it's, to my mind, a question of the resistance of the post-communist area after 1989 to Western capitals' goals to sort of neo-colonize the whole area. This effort was met by fierce resistance by Russian capitalists eventually, and also gradually by local capital owners, investors, etc., in Central Europe. So I think there's both a reason in terms of tropes and a reason in terms of the political, geopolitical context to say that perhaps the difference between anti-Slavism and anti-Europeanism is one of kind rather than of some kind of continuity. But it's a very stimulating question, and you know, I do need to think more about it.
Okay, terrific. Now we have a question from Ruxandra Trandafoyu, and it is to Professor Kelmer again. One of the problems scholars working on Eastern Europe have is that they are dismissed as white. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'll start again. One of the problems scholars working on Eastern European have is that they are dismissed as white, middle class, and therefore privileged. How can Eastern Europeans speak confidently about racism directed at whites? I'm asking from the context of post-Brexit Britain, where microaggressions directed against Eastern Europeans are multiplying.
Yeah, this too is another one of those questions where I wouldn't mind hearing from the questioner what they think, because it touches on a very rich issue that, you know, needs to be thrashed out, and it's relatively a new topic. So I don't know if I'm going to answer it in the sense that the questioner is looking for, but I do worry that talking about Eastern Europeanism as a racism might be some kind of a cultural appropriation of anti-Black racism, which is our model. And I won't deny for 1 second that Black racism is far worse, obviously, than racism against Eastern Europeans. But racism against Eastern Europeans, as the questioner points out, in the Brexit context, there's an interesting article about it by Alina Rzepnikowska. We're collecting some data also. It certainly exists. So I'm not totally sure I'm answering the question, but I tried.
Well, perhaps I can inject an idea into this issue about Brexit and race, speaking as an outside Australian who has visited the UK a lot over the years, but I haven't really lived there. But it follows these things. and we have 8 minutes to go, by the way, we have to finish at 5 to the hour, is does the old concept of nativism have anything to offer us? I mean, we know, at least anecdotally, that there were Brits of South Asian descent whose, say, grandparents migrated from South Asia, who are British and feel very British, who voted for Brexit and regard Eastern Europeans who've only just arrived very much as outsiders and non-British, and is unwelcome, frankly, and it's competition in the labour market. There's a whole range of things. So, you know, does the language of race really help us understand what's going on here?
The situation in Britain is specific and is certainly could be discussed as nativism. I think all the more so that I'm not that familiar with Britain, but from what I do know, descendants of Eastern Europeans who act British are not as subjected to prejudice as people who are recent migrants. So that would argue in favor of nativism. But I think it's not a mutually exclusive issue. The image of Eastern Europeans has taken on these racist overtones much more after 1989 than it was the case before. And it's not limited to Britain. So we're then not talking about nativism. Let me just give you a provocative example without going to mention any particulars, but I do know of a case in which a journal was going to publish a discussion on a certain subject. And all the papers submitted by scholars from Eastern Europe were rejected, okay, by the editorial board. And somebody pointed out that this was happening, and the editorial board kind of woke up with a shock because they didn't realize that this had happened. And they reread the papers and realized that really some of them were pretty good, and they published them. And so I feel that there really is a very typical kind of structural Eastern Europeanism at work that doesn't even depend on an individual's hatred or dislike of Eastern Europeans. It's just this image that Eastern Europe equates failure. Okay? And that sort of spills over to like Eastern Europeans are not good, not experts at things. And but I think it's spoken of in terms of the failure of liberal democracy as it's perceived in Hungary and Poland. And in an effort to culturalize that failure, which is both a psychological relief, because then you don't have to think that we have the same things in the West, never mind Trump. But I think also elides consideration of how the difficulties that liberal democracy has experienced in some, not all of Eastern Europe, were the result of Western approaches in 1989 and after.
Okay, we've got 4 more minutes, so we have one more question. Everybody's going to keep things snappy. It's from Charlotte Fearn. It's again to Professor Kalmer. Is there ever a solution to combat racism that you speak of? Are we destined to live in a construct of traditional racism whereby discrimination and persecution exist alongside its long-standing history?
Well, so that question could be about whether we'll ever eliminate racism in the world. And I mean, I think that we should try, right? Like, it's like, will all men be brothers or all people be brothers and sisters? Will the lion lie down with the lamb? I don't know, but I think we're obliged to hope that this is possible. and to go in that direction. We are discovering, I think, as this conference shows, that race is a perennial issue, whereas many of us would have said, I think, sometime back that it's something that arose in the 19th century. In fact, I may have taught that to my students some time ago. But if it really does go back to ancient Rome and we find it in the Middle East and so forth, then perhaps we can't be too optimistic that it'll go away. If the question is whether prejudice against Eastern Europeans will go away, well, that I don't know, because racism is very flexible. I think it has appeared essentially in the form we know it in 1945, even though it has precedents. And I mean, I'm not optimistic that racism will go away, because maybe someone else will be picked on.
No. Okay, I'm actually going to slip one in, and this is to Ian Miller. How can we assess the long-standing influence of Frantz Fanon? Is it more among post-colonial theorists or generally? I mean, it's still iconic books and ideas decades later.
Can you hear me okay then?
Yeah, good.
Yeah, great. I think perhaps one of the earlier papers might be more knowledgeable about that than me, but certainly in relation to the 60s, you do get a lot of African-American activists looking at his ideas and his psychoanalytical ideas and thinking about what it means to be colonized almost internally or emotionally. I couldn't really comment perhaps on how he's been used since then, but I'm personally finding him a good framework now that the history of emotions are becoming quite popular, to think about different things and racism in particular. So I'm not sure I quite answered your question there.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, to start. Now, James, you're the boss. Where are we at?
Thank you very much, Dirk. I think there's so much for us to discuss there. I think we've only just scratched the surface, but I suppose that's the inevitable condition of the Q&A session in any panel with such great papers. I think we'll just have to draw things to a close, so I'll leave that to you, Dirk.
Okay. Well,
thank you. Thank you very much.
Three speakers for terrific papers and for keeping the time, so we also had plenty of time for discussion. That is not taken for granted. We've all been to conferences where people really went over and then you had to go straight to the break and there was no time to discuss one another. We participate in these events not just to be passive and listen, but also to be active and in dialogue. So I certainly got a lot out of these papers. I'm sure you did too. And I made a lot of notes to be able to chase up many of the points that were made here. James, congratulations to you so far for this terrific conference as well. So with that, we move on to the next phase, which James will enlighten us about.
Thank you very much, everybody. We're going to take a break for a few minutes, and we will be coming back for the final event of the conference with our inaugural PKC Millins Lecture with Professor Satnam Virdee. See you shortly. So before we start the PKC Millins Lecture, that's my cue to say goodbye to all of the people who have been watching the conference on our live stream on the YouTube channel for Monitor Racism magazine. Thank you very much indeed for your interest, and thank you for all those people who will be taking advantage of all of this fascinating content in the period ahead. So thank you very much, and please do stay tuned to the magazine. Thank you.